Today's episode, we're taking a look at the Lunging Strike Barbarian for Season 10 in Diablo 4. This is a beginner's guide for people brand new to Barbarian. If you're like a pro at Barb or something, this is probably not going to be the guide for you. It's mainly going to be for people who are either new to Diablo 4 or just new to Barbarian in general, or coming back to Barbarian. You haven't played in a couple seasons, you're just kind of wondering how this specific build works in Season 10. With that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the guide itself. So Lunging Strike Barbarian is pretty unique in itself because it's a build that quite literally revolves around basic attacks. And there's not too many builds in the game that just kind of rely off basic attacks like this. So with this build, you get an insane amount of damage just from your basic skills. And you also get the decent mobility as well coming from your Lunging Strike itself. And in the end game, this build works by using the Earthquake aspect with a couple of runes that we'll talk about later and stacking these earthquakes in one specific spot, leading to both great AoE and single target damage. Looking at its strengths and weaknesses, so the ease of play with this specific spec is literally just kind of hold down a button and do your damage. You of course are having to use your shouts off cooldown, but you're not really have to use things in a very specific order. So very easy to play. It also has really good push. If you're looking to take this thing into end game, this is actually the highest pit pushing build for Barbarian currently. So 5 out of 5 there. In terms of its speed farm, it's still pretty fast, and its bossing is still pretty strong, both coming in at 4 out of 5. But where this build really shines is by stacking your bleeds in a big AoE group and just kind of nuking them down. And then finally, the gearing is a little bit difficult. Mainly because you need so many different uniques for this to kind of work. Even in the Ancestral build, you still need 6 uniques to make this work. You need 2 Shard of Varathiels and then 4 other uniques on top of that. So there's a bit of farming to kind of get this online. But overall, once you finally get there, it's an extremely satisfying build to play. So gearing coming in at 3 out of 5. So coming to the core of what actually makes this work. So we've recently been introduced to the Hooves of the Mountain God. And this is what allows our Lunging Strike to actually cleave. Used to, we would use Bash to make our Lunging Strike cleave. Now we get to drop that all together, equip these boots, and our Lunging Strike will cleave. And you can farm these boots through the Beast in the Ice. The other core aspect of this is going to be our chest piece coming from Grigor. Inflicting bleeding on an enemy has a 60% chance to reduce the cooldowns of your skills by 1 second. And these work in pair with your boots because that turns your basic into a cleave, allowing multiple bleeds, allowing even further CDR. So back in the day, to get CDR on our shouts, we used to have to run like a specific aspect to get that CDR on our shouts. Now we can just equip this chest, and that kind of solves the CDR issue for us. And earlier I said you needed 2 Shard of Varathiels. I don't know what I was talking about. You need 1 Shard of Varathiel. It's going to make our basic skills deal way more damage, but at the cost of some primary resource, which is fine because we need something to spend primary resource on anyways, because nothing else really costs primary resource. You also want the Magnus Opus here. And this actually scales with our adaptability aspect. So we deal more damage the more fury that we have, but now it drains at 10 per second. And here's the adaptability aspect. We deal increased damage for each point of primary resource that we have. We're kind of double dipping into that more damage per point of fury that we have. We also like to have these gloves from Beast in the Ice. Basically, it makes our basic skills do a whole bunch of more AoE damage. And you also get plus 10 to basic skills, which is insane. And then one thing that I missed as well is through our chest, you get plus 8 to Lunging Strike if you can get these runic leggings. So yeah, I mean, we can talk about a lot of different things here. I think the last thing I'm going to touch on before we start moving to the actual abilities themselves is how do you get Fury in this build? So most of your Fury is actually going to come from the insane CDR that we get from our shouts. So the shouts by themselves don't give that much Fury. However, when you pair this with our vocalized empowerment aspect, you see your shout skills generate primary resource per second while active, so this can stack, right? You get a whole bunch of shouts up and you're getting a whole bunch of fury per second. And then also the adaptability aspect that we talked about earlier. Basic skills generate 5 additional primary resource once per skill. So that's kind of what is fueling the fire behind this. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to some of our abilities here. So we're putting some points into Frenzy here, and this gives us a decent amount of both movement speed and damage reduction. So if we move up here to our modifiers, Frenzy grants us attack speed, which we'll use on Lunging Strike. We're not really worried about the fury cost of any core skills. We're not running anything that's core. And then Combat Frenzy, you gain a 5% damage reduction, 5% movement speed per stack of Frenzy we have. So how do we actually activate this? Well, the way we actually activate this is through our Chaos perks, through Dual Threat. So casting a basic skill uses another equipped basic skill at the target, dealing 180% of normal damage. So again, we're kind of double dipping into basic skills. So whenever you cast a Lunging Strike, you're also going to be casting a Frenzy. Moving on, we of course have our lunging strike. We're gonna put 5 points into that, really using the frenzy to buff up our lunging strike. Looking at the first modifier, lunging strike deals increased damage and heals you for 2% max life when you damage a healthy enemy. Helps you with that initial pack pull. And then battle lunging strike, and this is going to inflict a bleed for us, which scales with a whole bunch of different modifiers that we're taking that we'll talk about later. But this is where a huge portion of your damage comes from. Okay, moving on, we're going to put 1 point into Rallying Cry. So Rallying Cry is going to do a few things. It's going to make us unstoppable. It's going to grant us a 10% max life, and it's going to fortify us. If you're not sure what fortify is, oh, I guess it's down here. It can tell us. So fortify characters take 15% reduced damage when you have as much fortify as current life. Moving on, we'll be taking Challenging Shout. Defensive tool here. This is going to taunt, give us damage reduction, and a more bonus max life. Warcry. This is going to grant us something called the Berserking effect, which you'll see down here at the very bottom. Berserking grants 25% increased damage and 50% movement speed. This effect lasts up to 5 seconds. So we want to permanently be in Berserking, and we can do this, obviously, through Warcry. But the other way that we can actually do this is through all the way down here, our ultimate, Wrath of the Berserker, and we actually take a unique that I did not talk about earlier, our helmet here. So casting Wrath of Berserker causes you to explode, and your direct damage is converted to fire damage, and then you deal 60 increased damage with this. You get a ton of CDR on your Wrath of Berserker, and this is going to play into us getting permanent uptime on our Wrath of the Berserker. And you want to put 5 points into this. This is a huge part of our damage, and we want to get this up as often as we possibly can. If we can press the button, we want to be pressing it. This is going to grant us that unstoppable. It's also going to grant us that berserking that we talked about earlier. And as your build progresses, you will be able to get permanent uptime on them. And how do we get that permanent uptime? Again, that's going to come from our boots, turning our lunging strike into AoE, which will then in turn grant CDR through our chest. Then finally, we're going to be running Unconstrained. So Berserking's bonus damage increases 60%, and then we always berserk when we are not healthy, under 80% health, and grants us 30% physical damage reduction. Okay, that's our abilities. Let's move on to the arsenal system. So if you're not really sure how the arsenal system works, it's a little bit confusing, to be honest. If we come up here to our frenzy, basically you can make specific spells use specific weapons. And right here, our frenzy, you can see it says dual wield on it. This means this spell will only be cast by our dual-wielded swords here. It can't be cast by anything else. However, Lunging Strike, if we go to it, it does not have any sort of tag like that. It doesn't have a bludgeoning tag. It doesn't have like a slashing tag. It doesn't have a dual-wield tag. So that means we can make our Lunging Strike use a different weapon. So we actually want to scroll down here. You can see at the very bottom here, it says Arsenal Selection, Bludgeoning. And the reason we want to do this is because two-handed weapons have the highest base damage in the game, and the expertise from this is also pretty strong. If we go over to the two-handed mace expertise, this is going to give us 15% in critical strike while berserking, and this is also going to give us a 10% chance to gain 5 fury when hitting an enemy, double this while berserking. So it allows us to take advantage of those. So just simply hover over your lunging strike, and you just press your middle mouse wheel and just tab over until Lunging Strike says bludgeoning. And then we also have our techniques slot over here on the left, and you're going to be using two-hand axe technique. So this means it will be benefiting from both two-handed axe expertise as well as two-handed mace expertise. So this is going to give us 10% increased damage to vulnerable enemies. And that's something we've not talked about yet, is how do you make an enemy vulnerable? That's going to come from our ring here. If we look at the lucky hit, this is a enchantment that you actually want to put on your ring. So up to a 68% chance to make enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds. So this will be something that you'll need to farm for. It is a pretty significant damage boost, but you need some way in your build to apply vulnerable. There's a couple other aspects that apply vulnerable just besides this one. Well, this one's not an aspect, this one's an affix, but there are aspects out there as well, like the Vampiric Curse that can apply vulnerable. So you can kind of play with that. Okay, moving on to our Chaos perk. So we're running a Beast Cornered. Tons of builds are using this right now because this pairs very well with Marred Guard. So a Beast Cornered, every 10% life you're missing, you gain 20% increased damage and 5% damage reduction. Spending resources also drains a percentage of your life equal to 30% of the resources spent, and then it will refund those resources to you. This cannot reduce you below 10% life. So this gives us a ton of increased damage and damage reduction, and this pairs well with Marred Guard. So the way that we're able to activate a Beast Cornered by staying below that health threshold is through Marred Guard. So you can no longer be healed above 50% life, And then we also gain 10% max resistance to all elements, 20% armor, and 100% increased Barbarian fortified generation. So this is going to make a big difference in you moving up the torments, because resist all is kind of hard to get, to be honest. Armor can be kind of hard to get. So this kind of helps offset that. We've already talked about dual threat, right? That's going to allow us to cast both Lunging Strike and Frenzy at the same time. And then we also have Accelerating Chaos. You're basically going to have these bursts of energy that go out. Each time they deal damage, we get CDR, which is great for our shouts. Okay, final thing I want to talk about is our Paragon board. So we're going to start out with Wrath as our very first glyph. Okay, well, let me hover over it. Here we go. So this is basically going to increase our critical strike damage, and our critical strikes are going to generate Fury. So that's another way that we're going to generate Fury. It's not just through our shouts. It also comes from Wrath. Our next board is going to be Blood Rage. Killing a bleeding enemy is going to grant us Berserking for 5 seconds, and then your damage is going to be increased even more when Berserking. So we want to make sure that we're permanently Berserking. We can do that through our, again, Wrath of the Berserker. We have a lot of ways for Berserking. You're not going to have any issues with that in this build. But also killing a bleeding enemy is going to grant that. We have Martial as well. So after casting a shout skill, the active cooldown of every other non-shout skill is reduced by 2 seconds. So that's going to give us even more CDR on our Wrath of the Berserker. It does not count as a shout. We have our Weapons Master. Swapping weapons grants you 8% of your max Fury. You deal 30% increased damage to injured and healthy enemies. Right, and that will pretty much proc for us passively. We're using Bludgeoning for Lunging Strike. We're going to be using Dual Wield for Frenzy. They both cast at the same time, so that will proc. And sorry, I moved over here. Here's a look at that board. And then we'll be running Revenge Glyph. I'm not really worried about the additional bonus from the Thorns damage. More worried about the legendary bonus, increasing our damage by 5%. Our board number 4 will be Carnage. Berserk now additionally grants us 50% attack speed and 30% increased fire and physical damage. Great with our Wrath of the Berserker. Then we'll be taking the Challenger Glyph for increased damage to elites. Board number 5 here will be Flawless Technique. We are still able to proc this regardless of taking dual threat. And then we're also taking Undaunted over here on the right, giving us a damage reduction the more fortified that we have. And additionally, increased damage while fortified, and the legendary bonus just flat out increased damage. Okay, last thing I want to go over here is our runes. So we'll probably start out with the Mani Zan rune. So casting 2 mobility or macabre skills are going to grant us offering, and then we could spend that offering on a guaranteed critical strike and a guaranteed overpower, and this will proc for us since we're attacking so fast in this build. About every second, you're going to be overpowering. So this is actually a huge source of our damage is overpower. Then our other 2 runes are going to be Pock and Tech. So spend 50% of our maximum resource, and then we will put down this Earthquake on the ground. And that Earthquake will do a whole bunch of damage through our Earthquake aspect, actually. So we're not running Ground Stomp, so you can ignore that. But our Earthquake will damage enemies for a whole bunch of damage over 4 seconds. And while standing in the Earthquake, we will gain 120% increased damage. So a huge damage amp force just by standing in these stacking Earthquakes. So very key that you have these specific runes in this aspect as well. Again, that's one of the things that kind of stinks about this build is it is a little bit difficult to gear. It does kind of require some specific items. But overall, it is the best build at the moment, and it's pretty fun to play.